Welcome to the Politics and Media Show with me, John Rees. Does the Pakistani community need to put its house in order? This was the provocative issue raised in yesterday's Big Question debate on the BBC. The show saw it as appropriate to put the Pakistani community in the spotlight in the wake of the convictions of 9 Asian men for child sex exploitation. The BBC is not alone in highlighting the ethnicity of the accused men, with other headlines and comment pieces referring to the men as either a Pakistani or an Asian gang. But with little nationwide evidence on street grooming, the question is why the media is focusing on the ethnicity. Well, before we examine this, let's take a look at this report on the media's handling of the Rochdale case and other similar cases.
Is the UK's Asian community somehow more likely to spawn criminal paedophile gangs that target young white girls? Well, according to certain sections of the British media, the answer is yes. Many have focused on the ethnicity of 9 men convicted last week in Rochdale for running a child sexual exploitation ring. But do they have a point? Last year, The Times loudly declared that a conspiracy of silence around groups of Pakistani men sexually exploiting white British girls. The paper claimed that political correctness and fear of appearing racist had taken precedence over child protection. The terms Pakistani and Asian have been routinely used to report on several cases where all the defendants have been Asian. Former Cabinet Minister Jack Straw waded into the debate, calling on the Pakistani community to take responsibility. But others don't see it as a cultural or racial issue. Reacting to the Rochdale convictions, Assistant Chief Constable Steve Hayward of Greater Manchester Police denied that the ethnicity of either the defendants or the victims was a factor. It's not a racial issue. This is about adults preying on vulnerable young children. It just happens that in this particular area and time, the demographics were that these were Asian men. In an article for The Guardian last week, Ella Cockbain, who is a researcher at the UCL's Department of Security and Crime Science, wrote, "At the moment, our nationwide figures on on-street grooming are patchy and incomplete. We need a better, more efficient system of data collection and collation. What's more, these data need to be comparable and consistent across the country and across different agencies involved." So the question is, why then, if the evidence simply isn't there, is the media generalising and in effect casting aspersions on an entire community because of the actions of a tiny minority? In its leading article last Thursday, the independent newspaper said, "Because the men are all Asian Muslims and the victims were all white, some right-wing extremists have been attempting to make political capital from the case, and they have been abetted by right-wing newspapers whose anti-immigration agenda is fed by suggestions that underage grooming is a problem peculiar to the Asian community. Police and social workers, on the other hand, who are anxious not to inflame racial tensions, insist the crimes are not racially motivated, and, for their caution, have been accused of maintaining a culture of silence."
Well, with me in the studio to discuss this is Dr. Elena Martellozzo of Middlesex University. She's a leading academic and last year wrote Online Child Sex Abuse, Grooming, Policing and Child Protection in a Multimedia World. We also have Alyas Karmani. He's an imam, mentor and psychologist and youth worker who's director of STREET, the strategy to reach, educate and empower teenagers. We also have Ella Cockbain, who's currently researching complex group-based child sexual exploitation, including the internal trafficking of minors within the UK. All of you, welcome to the show. And first of all, why do you think there is such a disjunction between the way in which these cases have been reported and the actual facts on the ground about child sex abuse?
I would say mainly for lack of understanding of the problem of child sexual abuse. I think we all agree here that child sexual abuse exists in all communities, and focusing on the racial aspect of it, it's rather dangerous. Dangerous because we tend to overlook at actually what are the real motivations of sex offenders, and also who are these victims and their vulnerability. So I think it's important to not oversimplify the problem. Child sexual abuse is not that simple to understand. And we need to, before making comments like this, to stop and understand what makes these young people so vulnerable.
So, Alice, what do you think the actual facts are here? If it's not as it's portrayed in this case by at least some sections of the media, what are we looking at as a kind of as a social problem?
Well, we've always framed this as a young urban male issue. And it cuts across the UK, it cuts across all communities, all backgrounds, all social classes. And because Street works nationally, we've got projects in West Yorkshire and Birmingham, in London, then we see that national picture. And we also work with ethnicities across the board. So we've seen patterns in South London, which are unique to South London. We've seen patterns in West Yorkshire. We've seen patterns in Hull. So the fact is, this is an issue which cuts across the board. We think that and how we've always framed this is that there is a profound problem with regards to how young men look at sexuality and relationships in society. And this is often informed by the fact that they are conflicted living in an over-sexualized society. They don't have role models who really give them a firm understanding of in terms of what is an emotionally caring and supportive relationship. So they've got really distorted views about what a positive relationship is, how to engage in meaningful relationships. But on top of that, they've got socializers such as, gangster rap videos, immersed in hardcore degrading pornography as well. And really, one of the consistent things that we've seen across with a lot of these young men, again, across all ethnicities, is that they've had very little meaningful sex and relationship education. If you consider that, young people probably have, in the whole of their school life, probably 3 45-minute lessons to deal with very, very complex issues. So we've identified that the street is the main educator. And then you have the opportunity for these young men also to become quite exploited, and they're quite vulnerable when stronger, more powerful men actually manipulate them and use them and actually kind of embroil them into criminality. So another pattern we've identified, again, not unique to one community, is where you've got drug supply, where you've got criminal gangs, you've always had the pimping of girls. And unfortunately, if you have individuals who are being channeled into that, then they're going to get involved in that behaviour. It cuts across all ethnicities. And one of the key things that we try to do at Street is actually break that channel by being located at that physical space where young people are vulnerable, girls and boys. We're trying to channel them away from that behaviour through active mentoring and providing them some really robust, meaningful engagement and education as well.
Ella, to be honest, when I was reading the background material on this, it came as quite a shock that there aren't nationally sort of respectable or audited or properly collated figures on this. Why is that?
I think the studies which have been conducted have done the best they can with the available data, but the important thing to understand is since January 2011, we've all been talking about on-street grooming as if it were a distinct criminal offence. It's not, it never has been. What we're really talking about is a pattern of child sexual exploitation, which may or may not include an element of trafficking, which encompasses numerous different criminal offences. So you might have rape, sexual activity with a child, you might have child pornography offences, prostitution offences, you might have false imprisonment, drug offences, things completely not connected to sexual offences. And as a result, if we've now decided as a nation that we want to take this particular set of sexual offences seriously, on-street grooming, then we need a clear definition around what we're measuring, and then we need to start to extract that data. So the best study so far in terms of nationwide reach is CEOPS, the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Centre's 2011 report. But you have to bear in mind that the data analysis process can only be as good as the data collected, and it can be very difficult for individual police forces, it can be very difficult for children's services to extract the relevant data if it's not been stored on the system with a tag saying child sexual exploitation or on-street grooming. Because what you've got to understand is not all rape cases will be on-street grooming, not all sexual activity with a child will be on-street grooming. So we've got this really complex web of offences, and it's just very difficult at this stage to be putting them all out.
So is it one thing that you're saying is that in actual fact this is not a separately categorised offence?
No.
So there aren't figures for it. So this allows the media, when there are individual cases, as there was in the Rochdale case, where it involves Asian men, they can project this as if it's a statistically typical thing when, well, we've probably no idea, but from some of the figures that I saw, for instance, on Greater Manchester's sexual offenders register, 95% of the people on it are white. So the likelihood is, even if we did have this set of figures, they wouldn't. Yes
and no. So for sexual offences as a whole, in the United Kingdom, and for child sexual offences in particular, the majority of offenders
as what you would expect in this country, are white, and the majority of offenders are men. When you look at the CEOP study, which is for localised grooming, so a particular subset of child sexual exploitation, there's a pattern emerging that about 49% of the offenders whose ethnicity they could ascertain were white, and 46% were of Asian heritage. And that's not broken down into Pakistani or Bangladeshi or anything. All we know is it's Asian, and that's because that was the level of detail available in the data. So nonetheless, 46% in a country where only 7% of the population is Asian is concerning. But I think the real issue with the media is that they're taking these very big cases, which represent just a fraction of on-street grooming and just a fraction of child sexual exploitation and an even smaller fraction of child sexual abuse more generally, and they're projecting it as if this is the entire problem, which is not.
Is that how you see what's going on here? That there's a broad or a broader sort of array of offences that are to do with the exploitation of children sexually, but that there's one element here that could be singled out as not majoritarian, but a disproportionately high level of Asian involvement, and then we focus on that and exclude everything else?
I think it's rather convenient, given the case, of course. But I totally agree with Ella here that we simply don't know enough. We know that children don't report the fact that they've been sexually exploited, abused, either at home or outside the home. We just focus on those figures that are available to us. And we really need to take these figures with a pinch of salt, and we simply can't generalise. We can't just assume that because we have this number saying that, you know, certain percentages of Asian ethnicity or white, that's the problem. We have to continue with research. We have to continue to look at this issue, not to point any fingers at anyone, but just to understand what the problem is and to help these communities to further either prevent the problem through education, as you rightly raised, or to look at how we can help sex offenders to understand how, to stop themselves from abusing.
I mean, there's two sides to this, to the way that the media is presenting it and selecting the information. I mean, one is that there's a racial demonisation of a particular section of the community, but as if not more appalling is the fact that by misreading who is carrying out child sex abuse, we're going to misdirect the police forces, social workers, others that should be looking out for it.
Well, I think, there has been a media frenzy. It's been a bit of a circus, and I think it's done a complete disservice, I think, to, practitioners who are actually working in child sexual exploitation and the whole sexual violence field. It's done a complete disservice to it because it's actually confounded the whole discussion. And we've racialised an issue which is much more complex than that. So obviously you've got communities who are told to be vigilant and they think, well, all Pakistanis are perpetrators. And so we're kind of just vilifying and demonising a whole community. And looking at your little kind of media bit, it's interesting. There are parallels with how we've looked at violent radicalisation with the same composite photos of Asian faces. And what it does is that it just creates that demonising process. You have a collective blame of a whole community. So, I found in the whole debate, it's not been driven by practitioners and experts. And when the experts' voices have been expressed, then they're seen as apologists for criminals. So when we try to have a meaningful debate, really being critical in the issues, and, it hasn't been well received. But then we've got the other extreme where we've got individuals who are saying, yes, it is a problem in the community. Of course, there are challenging issues, but we have to deal with them in a cohesive approach, as we've been mentioning, where we look at the core motivations and the factors which influence men to perpetrate violence like this. And one of the interesting things that I've certainly identified as a parallel is if we go back to Nazi Germany, Goebbels made a film called Das Juden, which was about vilification of Jews. And one of the levels at which he vilified Jews was the whole idea of them being sexual predators in that society. And that creates a sense that the moderate mainstream then starts to, again, label a whole community with a particular type of behaviour, caricaturing them through ethnicity and then associating them as sexual predators preying on vulnerable white girls. Now, if we took and we see a parallel with that today with Muslims, obviously, and then that feeding into the kind of far-right narrative as well. And what we don't find is that, you could equally say that race and sexual violence, both, it has a role, race has a factor in all sexual violence, because when you've got a white European sex tourist, why are they going to Thailand and abusing in a particular way? Equally, there's an enormous amount of narrative in relation to the black slave trade and the fact that white slave masters raped tens and thousands of black slaves. And again, that was an act of sexual violence that was racially motivated. So unfortunately, it's always been there. We need to take a cohesive approach, not focus on one community to the exclusion of the others. And as a result of that, we actually create these racial tensions. We reinforce these racial tensions in British society, which really shouldn't be there.
I mean, Elena, do you think that this is part of the problem with drawing back and looking at the issue in a wider sense? It would highlight other institutions that should come under scrutiny in the society, and B, it would, as Alyas has been saying, it would raise historical questions about this as well. It seems to me that the media's really not geared to dealing with the issue in that way, is it?
Well, I think that certain types of offences that are, as you rightly said, racially motivated. If we think about genital mutilation, for example, if you think about the use of acid against women within the domestic environment, well, in that case, it's appropriate, and we need to understand what the cultural tensions are. But when it comes to child sexual abuse, as I said before, it really cuts across all sectors and all different stratas of society. Any offender is potentially an offender, so it's certainly not to do with the race here. The media conveniently have focused on this case because the gang was of Pakistani origin, so therefore we're just focusing on the offender rather than looking at what is the problem here. We should focus really on the victims and the whole community rather than just looking at the fact that they are of Pakistani ethnicity. Really.
I mean, in the Derby case, I mean, it was, which is just over a year and a few months ago, there was a similar kind of furore in the press, and oddly, I think it was exactly or perhaps not oddly, but given what we've been saying, but on exactly the same day in Cambourne, there was a case of, let me see if I've got this right, 3 white men who were involved in organised sex abuse of up to 30 victims. Now, that never made the press. I mean, there is a massive disjunction. Coincidentally, we have these cases on the same day last time, but in general, there's a massive disjunction on the reporting, isn't there?
I think it's difficult for me to say because if a case isn't reported, how do we know it's not reported unless we had a personal involvement in that case? So it's very hard to measure the degree to which the portrayal of these cases is distorted. I wanted to add something to what Elena said. I think while I agree completely that child sexual abuse is very, very complicated, that there are many, many dimensions to addressing it, I think part of the issue with the whole debate around on-street grooming recently is we've become so caught up in talking about race and talking about racism and talking about all that side of things that we've forgotten to talk about what we can do, which is why it was so heartening to see what Alyas was saying. But I think the important thing to emphasise is, based on the picture we have at the moment, there is definitely a lot that the Pakistani community and the Asian community more broadly can be doing. They are not the only community who have things they can be doing, and they shouldn't be scapegoated, they shouldn't be forced to take the blame for everything that's going on. But at the same time, it's pointless to miss opportunities to engage people who might have a very important role to play in combating this form of exploitation in future.
What do you make of the fact that the unit inside the police dealing with this, which you've mentioned, the CHOPS unit, has now been absorbed into the National Crime Agency? Do you think that this is the police downplaying this, or are they bringing more resources to it, or what do you think is happening with the policing of this issue? No,
the important thing to remember is that CEOP, the Child Exploitation Online Protection Centre, the unit you're talking about, is responsible for a huge range of child protection issues. Elena will have dealt with them probably in relation to online exploitation. They've just taken over responsibility for child trafficking within the UK and into the UK, missing children. So they have a number of different strands. This isn't the only thing they do. And it's been maintained right from the start that as they go into the National Crime Agency, they will maintain their independence, they will maintain their focus on child protection issues. So I don't see that as anything we should be concerned about.
Alice, what do you think about the policing issue? Because I mean, I think it was the Assistant Chief Constable of Manchester very clear there. So I mean, in some cases, this is an issue to do with the police as well as the press. On this issue, do you think so or not?
Well, I think so. Yeah, most definitely. There's been, you know, a large number of very vulnerable girls who have slipped through the net, and clearly that was the case in Rochdale as well. You know, again, there's been that accusation of political correctness. You know, that the police, I suppose, are you know, scared to tread. You know, they're treading on eggshells, really. You know, they don't know how to deal with this issue because of its cultural complexity. It's not. It's quite a simple issue. And this is, again, we've got to get away from. I think sometimes police suspend common sense and their judgment. No, it's not a complex cultural issue. It's a very simple issue of safeguarding vulnerable individuals. Do your job, and do your job effectively. One of the things I've always said is that, you know, the Pakistani community, the Muslim community in the UK don't want special treatment. We don't want to be handled with what I call kid gloves. We don't want that PC culture. We just want fair, equal treatment. Treat us just like everyone else, have a cohesive approach to dealing with all communities. Now, one thing that will help them and enable them to do that is good partners within the Pakistani community, key individuals, community leaders, imams, activists, youth workers, educationalists, who are close to the kind of unique, what I call nuances within their own community, to actually give them that, what I call that cultural knowledge or that understanding of how to navigate and negotiate some of those challenging issues. But it's not complicated. It's not complicated at all. You've got to find the how and the who, really, to do so. But we just want that fair and equal treatment just that every other community has, really. OK, well, I'm going to have to stop you there because we're just coming up to the break. But this is a serious issue, and we'll be returning for further discussion when you rejoin us for the second part of the Politics and Media programme. Welcome back to the second part of the Politics and Media show, where we're discussing the press coverage and the aftermath of the Rochdale child sex abuse case. And before the break, Alyas Karmani, who's the co-director of Street, was just talking about the police's role in all this. So let's pick up that. Elena, what's your take on how the police have been responding to these cases?
Well, I can only speak out of my own experience. I've been working alongside the London Metropolitan Police for about 10 years now, and I've been witnessing the hard work and developing tactics to prevent as well as help victims of child abuse. I can simply say that they're doing a fantastic work. They've placed the child at the centre. They've developed some proactive techniques to protect children from abuse. And at the moment, what they're doing as well, they're trying to focus on the victims, as I was saying before, trying to understand why do victims fail to report, or why do they drop out of this difficult process of getting offenders to court. So I think, you know, I'd like to emphasise here that, yes, the police is doing some great work. And particularly, I can only speak for the London Metropolitan Police. They've got a dedicated team that is just simply working towards the protection of these vulnerable people and vulnerable children.
Ella, do you think then that that the Assistant Chief Constable of Manchester, we heard him in the clip at the head of the programme, really condemning this kind of racialisation of the issue? Do you think that's a typical understanding in the police, because it wouldn't fit with many people's, you know, conceptions of the broader role of the police?
I think the typical understanding within the police that I've been working with, which has been 7 forces across the UK, is that these are criminals and they must be treated as criminals. And there's been a huge push in the past few years towards developing more efficient systems for dealing with child sexual exploitation, for improving ways of detecting it, for handling the victims, for looking into more innovative ways of working with other agencies. Because a lot of the time there's a lot of police blaming that goes on here. But what is important to remember is only a small fraction of child sex abuse in general, child sexual exploitation in particular, will ever get reported to the police. So it's absolutely critical that there are other partner agencies out there are able to feed in information, able to support investigations. And this is a job for everyone, not just the police.
And that's, I mean, Alice raised it earlier, but there's been some involvement, and we heard it in the clip, there's been some involvement of the far right in this. The EDL had protests outside the court. What do you make of this side of the thing? Do you think it's driving some of the news agenda?
Well, you know, they're all different political views, so it's very difficult to assess what they're trying to achieve. It might be the case that they're trying to drive the focus elsewhere, but we don't know, do we? I think it's important to look at actually what the problem is. And as Ella said, it's important to, particularly for the police and other agencies, to work together, to cooperate together, to be able to tackle this problem. You know, working in isolation, it's not going to succeed. Nobody's going to succeed.
I mean, you know, I mean, the EDL in particular is an organisation that was founded on the principle of demonising the Muslim community. Islamophobia is practically its only policy platform. Do you think it was inevitable that they would head for a case like this?
Of course, it's inevitable. I think this is where it's important for the community to send out a very strong message that this is completely unacceptable behaviour. There is nothing in Pakistani culture, or certainly in terms of Islam as well, which in any way justifies this. But I think it's about getting the balance right as well. I've often said that one case is one case too many. And by highlighting those cases which are within the Pakistani community, what we're saying is that this is completely unacceptable behaviour. Unfortunately, what I find is that it gets lost in the media frenzy. So it's really the media which is giving the most oxygen to the far right. And they need to have a much more informed debate and discussion. I think in the last week, 10 days, I haven't heard of a really meaningful discussion on this issue. It's just been sound bites. Unfortunately, that feeds into the kind of far right narrative as well. But it is important for the community as a whole to send out a very strong message that this is completely reprehensible and unacceptable behaviour, and we have solidarity with the victims. But also what's interesting is a lot of people saying to me that, you know, as a member of the Pakistani community and the Muslim community, I'm expected to do this. But then the mainstream white community, where obviously, you know, 90% of sex offenders are white, indigenous, often males as well, there isn't an expectation on the mainstream to come out and be as vociferous against its own sex offenders. So why, again, is there this differential treatment? Somehow, every time there's an incident, you know, we have to come out and we have to publicly condemn it, whereas that doesn't happen in the mainstream. So in many ways, that also accentuates the exclusion, you know, that the Pakistani kind of community feels, and it's just another unhelpful label that we're having to deal with.
Ella, do you think the press coverage gives the far right a chance to focus on these cases? Because, you know, when we saw that, and it's not the Sun, it's the front page of the Times with the mugshots lined up on the front page. I mean, I don't know, maybe I've missed it, but I've never seen that for the cases of abuse that have gone on within the Catholic Church. You don't see a sort of, you know, 9 priests lined up, although it will be easy enough to find 9 priests. So do you think that this kind of coverage is feeding the far right?
I think the thing to remember is this kind of coverage has only really existed since January last year. The British National Party has had what they call, erroneously, Muslim paedophilia on their manifesto since the early 2000s. So no, I would say the far-right interest in this issue predates the press storm around it. I would also disagree slightly with Alyas in that I think while once again, like in January last year, we've had a lot of focus on race, I think certain members of the media have been making a concerted effort to move away from this unhelpful fixation with race and to start to look in more detail at things which can be tackled more effectively, at trying to understand different dimensions to the crime, about trying to talk about the grooming process, how it works, trying to do things which can inform better practice. But again, I mean, I think the coverage is limited and it's often ill-informed, which is distressing, especially when we see new stereotypes start to emerge. Like, for example, in the Rochdale case, many of the girls were in care. As a result, it's been across all the newspapers in the past few days that this is predominantly a care problem. In the cases that we've worked on, there's actually been very few of the victims who've been in care, and even those who were in care went into care after the abuse had taken place as a result of changes in their behaviour linked to the trauma.
When you say this, do you mean print media? Because, I mean, you know, to watch the BBC News, the BBC News report on the night was, look, come on, this is obvious. There
have been documentaries, there have been attempts to deal with this more in depth, to deal with it more carefully. Certain channels have have run longer pieces, have run more discursive pieces. I think the will is there. It's just a lot of people spending a lot of time either playing the race card or trying to fight back the accusations that this is just a Pakistani problem. And because of that, there's not that much time left to talk about more important issues. So what I would like to see is that the next time there's one of these cases, if the defendants are white or black, or whatever they are, I don't want to see a front page saying 9 white men convicted. But equally, if there's 9 Asian men convicted, I don't want to see a front page saying this proves that, you know, all on-street groomers are Asian. It doesn't prove anything. At the moment, we have a tiny sample of cases. The smaller cases involving 1 or 2 offenders typically aren't getting the same kind of coverage. The victimisation of boys isn't getting the same kind of coverage. And we're fixating too narrowly on one element, and that's only going to harm victims in the end.
Yeah.
I mean, were you surprised when the news came out that Nick Griffin of the BNP had tweeted the verdict before it was announced? Because, I mean, you know, my legal experience is limited, but when I've done jury service, this is the one thing that never happens. You're told this is, you know, what happens is the foreman of the jury decides, he tells the judge when he's asked. That's the first time anybody knows anything about it.
I wasn't surprised at all, personally. Again, it's lack of understanding of the problem. Going back to what we were saying before about playing the race card, we've seen in the past as well that, you know, we all know that sex offending and child abuse is probably one of the most hated crimes amongst all communities and all societies. There's not one single religion that promotes sexual abuse. I think it's something that is very important to remember and to take into account. And looking at the media, even in the past of cases, we've seen maybe not photos of priests in the front page, but the church has received a lot of demonization, if we want to be really truthful about this. You know, if we think of the Vatican, of the Irish church, it's, you know, it's been there in the media. If we think of priests, you know, we often sadly think, oh, sex offenders. And this is all coming through the news. So I wasn't surprised to see this in the media at all, because it has happened in the past, even if it wasn't about Pakistani communities. But white Catholic, Roman Catholic, Irish Catholic, it has happened before. That's, again, lack of understanding of the problem. And focusing on something that it's convenient rather than the actual issue, that it's child abuse and those victims that are, you know, vulnerable young girls or boys.
But it, obviously, clearly, there is a due process, and this is being breached. You know, how did Nick Griffin know about the verdict before it was even announced, before even the jury had come back? So
But
clearly,
that's presuming that he did know about the verdict.
Oh, yeah, maybe
Which
he
we
was
don't
under
know at all. He might not have known at all.
speculation.
You're saying that he maybe sort of tweeted that he knew when he didn't know.
If I send a tweet right now saying I know about the verdict of an ongoing case, it doesn't prove I actually did.
I think the legal team representing one of the defendants, Alyas Yusuf, made a statement last week where he said it is evident that he was given information, okay, before the verdict was actually
But he also
announced.
said he had no evidence to prove that at all, and they were seeking to find evidence. I think it's careful we don't jump to conclusions on it. I think the important thing to remember that is tweeting a verdict, whether you know anything about it or not, is a really, really stupid thing to do, and it only harms the victims in those cases. The victims go through an excruciating court process, and you don't want to put them through that again.
But I mean, that is going to be the upshot of this, isn't it? Because clearly, if the verdict was announced before it was announced to the court, if indeed he did know it, then that will be grounds for a retrial, I imagine.
That's right, yeah.
Trying to look forward a little bit forward here. If you were in a situation now where you could issue guidelines to, well, both the people responsible for the care of vulnerable young people, and to the press in their treatment of it, what would it be, Elena?
Well, in terms of care of young people, I think it's really important to focus on education. Often young people don't know that they've been groomed, and they don't often see it as sexual abuse. So I think it's important to work very closely with young people, but particularly the most vulnerable. This is not to say that only vulnerable young people are likely to be abused. I mean, I've worked in many countries. I've worked in the Middle East, I've worked in Italy, and I've come across young victims that were coming from very affluent backgrounds, with both mum and dad at home, having been looked after, but maybe sexually abused by someone that they trusted within the area of the church or school or, you know, the vicinity of their home. So I think that's a very important message to put forward. Then in terms of organisations and practitioners working in this area of work, like yourself, like ourselves, I think it's important to share knowledge, to share the understanding, to explain to each other really what the problem is, to work in partnership. And this is not just about the police working with social workers and probations and health, etc. It's about all of us. We all have a responsibility that we can really make full use of it, and to help this problem to maybe not to stop, certainly to prevail.
Alice, looking forward, what would you say?
Well, I think there's already a massive framework around safeguarding out there. I don't think it's really being implemented as well as it should. And I want to go back to Victoria Cumbria inquiry. There was an important kind of statement there, which was about assumptions around race can be as corrosive as racism. So we've got to get away from these assumptions because they really misdirect us, and I think that's important. At Street, I think what we've always said is that you've got to have, one, be close to the issue, and you've got to speak the same language as young people. You've got to understand their reality, their lived reality, understanding the challenges that they have. And you've got to be at that physical space and as well as that psychological space in terms of how people think and when you're there, then you can actually channel young people away from at-risk behaviour and you can identify those vulnerabilities. I don't think enough of that is happening. And too many young people as a result of that obviously are not being safeguarded. And that's the key thing. I think it's all about implementation. It's about practitioners being far more astute of, I think, some of the local challenges in their own areas. And that is, again, coming back to partnership with good, effective agencies. Now, the biggest challenge we have at Street is resources. We know that we can have a significant impact in terms of prevention. We know we can do it. But where are the resources to actually support that work at the grassroots level? It's not there. We know we're having discussions all around the country with safeguarding boards, trying to get projects off the ground since last year. And we've been unable to do that because everyone says we haven't got the funding. Or the funding is too caught up in the statutory sector and they're not supporting third sector and street-based intervention providers. They're not supporting those projects at all as well. So we have a big challenge in terms of the resources needed to actually deliver the work on the ground. And also our prevention program in terms of our workshops. Again, I could be delivering, my team could be delivering workshops every day across the UK to all ethnicities and all backgrounds. But where are the resources? We're not getting the resources to actually do it.
Ella?
I think we need better education among children, so among all potential victims, that anything you do in the lead up or after being abused does not make the abuse okay. It doesn't stop what happened to you being a sexual offence. So if you were drunk, if you'd taken drugs, if you got in someone's car, if you didn't tell anyone about it for 3 weeks, for 4 weeks, for 4 months, it doesn't mean you weren't a victim of rape or some other sex crime. I also think, as Elena said, I think sharing knowledge, sharing information, finding out more about these crimes, trying to appreciate a broader picture of what's going on, and questioning whether the relationships are as straightforward as we think. So, for example, someone might be working in a takeaway that might give them excellent access to children, it might give them excellent gifts to give the children, it might give them an excellent excuse to be out all night. And we might look at that and say, oh, they're working in a takeaway and they're Asian, therefore they're abusing because they're Asian. Whereas actually it might come down to the fact that it's the access provided by their job and the lack of the control that creates an environment conducive to the abuse. So I think thinking about factors like that, trying to go into a bit more detail and understand things a bit better. In terms of the media coverage, my plea would be, if you're going to be presenting something as an argument which is not founded on evidence, make it clear that these are your assumptions. So what we've had is a lot of rushing to explain things as if it was clear and definite that they exist when they may not even exist at all, and a lot of assumption that's been presented as hard-cut, straightforward fact.
Because, I mean, in a way, there's a I suppose, ironic contrast to be had in the fact that the Levinson inquiry is taking place into press standards as this is going on. The Levinson inquiry, you know, put perfectly legitimate series of issues that it's dealing with, but it's not dealing with this, which many people I think would say is arguably as important as anything that's come before the Levinson inquiry. So perhaps it should be included in that remit, do you think?
Quite possibly.
Alyas? And in terms of how the press should be responding?
Well, look, it sells papers, you know, race and sex, it sells papers. Clearly it does, and it's exactly the kind of sensationalist stories that they want. And you can imagine, look, the amount of column inches it's had. You know, you wouldn't get the same coverage if there were white sex offenders. So obviously, clearly, you know, the media needs to take some social responsibility here and recognise that this kind of reporting actually creates far more racial tensions. It affects community cohesion issues, and they need to be much more kind of informed in terms of the whole discussion as well.
Elena.
Well, I teach research methods at university, and I always say to my students, you know, whatever you read, whatever you learn, whatever you understand, go back to these numbers and ask yourself, what is the overall sample? You know, what does 33% mean? Don't be afraid of understanding and analysing this data further. So I definitely agree with my co-speakers here. You know, maybe the media should really have more founded evidence before they make any kind of speculation. But then we go back to the business of the media, which is, you know, the most sensationalist, the more probably newspaper we sell. So, yes, perhaps they should be more funded on evidence. But on the other hand, I think that also the public, the community, everybody that reads the newspaper should be a little bit more critical of what they absorb.
Alex, I mean, you touched on this earlier, and perhaps we haven't talked about it enough, but there is a context here of the general treatment of the Muslim community. All right, this has got nothing to do with, formally has nothing to do with the war on terror, has nothing to do with other issues of Islamophobia, but when it starts coming up on the front pages, of course, you know, the readers and the people who are watching, the viewers of news programmes, don't have compartmentalised minds like that.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I've always said there's no shortage of labels that you could throw to Pakistanis and Muslims, whether we're cricket cheats or paedophiles, you know, the list goes on. And, you know, this creates almost a siege mentality within the community who become more insular. And actually, you know, rather than engage in the mainstream, actually profoundly lack confidence. And also there's a leadership crisis as well. We haven't got enough individuals who can actually provide a robust response to those, which are balanced, not overly defensive, but not being apologists either. So we're always stuck in a rock and a hard place. And I think this is really important that we have to change this paradigm. You know, if we consider from 2001 up until, you know, just recently, we've had an onslaught in terms of the media with the war on terror, with issues around inclusion, the burqa, the list goes on in terms of the issues. Now, if you're a young person growing up in British society, you're a young Muslim growing up, these are your formative years. These are very, very challenging formative years that you've had, which have actually made you feel that you're not part of the mainstream because you're constantly batting away these issues. And you're constantly in reactive mode, unfortunately. And you're not able, therefore, to become proactive. And be more mainstream. So we've got to change that paradigm on a societal level, okay, so that we demonstrate that Muslims, okay, Islam is part and parcel of the social fabric of British society, and it actually massively contributes. You know, there's an enormous positive contribution that Muslims make that is completely kind of ignored by stories like this. If we talk about business sector or talk about Muslim professionals or Muslim bus drivers, you know, it's a tremendous amount of contribution that's somehow just completely ignored because we focus on these issues to the exclusion of, obviously, the kind of broader context. So the media has to change its paradigm. And the community, I think, you know, there's you know, I suppose a tendency to retreat. We shouldn't retreat. We should engage much more and be involved in the debate and be involved in the discussion. I've got to say, on my Facebook, there's been a really positive discussion, really informed discussion on the issue in the last week.
Okay, well, on that point, we're going to have to leave it because that's all we've got time for this week. But we'll be returning to this and related issues in future editions of the Politics and the Media show. So I hope you'll join us.